Three possible strategies for redressing, or at least mitigating, the replication crisis across scientific fields by Spencer Antonio Marlen-Starr, published here on Medium on August 15th, 2023. Introduction. I'm a big fan and admirer of science and the philosophy of science. My bachelor's degree is in economics, the most quantitative and systematic of all social sciences, and I almost obtained a minor in the logic and philosophy of science as well. Furthermore, I have a master's of science degree. Because of my deep interest in economics specifically, I began regular listening to one of the longest running podcasts that is still going, namely Econ Talk, which originally started all the way back in 2006. Within a month of getting my first smartphone when I was 18, all the way back in August of 2013, when I began my first semester of college. As an unexpected result of this, I listened to an Econ Talk which first aired on November 16th, 2015, with Brian Nozick talking about the reproducibility project in academic psychology very shortly after that episode came out. I don't know very much about psychology, although my mom has a PhD in the topic, but I do know enough to know that human memory sucks. However, I'm fairly confident that I was dismayed. I remember enough to know that I was dismayed at how few of the 100 peer-reviewed psychology papers that Nozick and the rest of the psychologists who had volunteered to try to replicate the experiments or whatever other type of studies that they'd selected. Um, the 100 papers, by the way, were selected at random from psychology papers in three relatively high prestige or impact journals in 2008. They did this research from about 2013 and 2014. Sorry, 2011, and took them 3.5 years to finish. To quote the results of the 100 attempted replications at length from Nozick himself, replication effects were half the magnitude of original effects, representing a substantial decline. 97% of original studies had statistically significant while only 36% of replications had statistically significant results. 47% of original effect sizes were in the 95% confidence interval of their replication effect size, which is atrocious if you don't know. 39% of effects were subjectively rated to have been replicated uh, by to have replicated the original result by the replicators themselves, and if no bias in original results is assumed, combining original and replication results left 68%, a meager 68% of them, with statistically significant findings. Correlational tests suggest that replication success was better predicted by the strength of original evidence than by characteristics of the original and replication teams. So, going off the subjective assessments of the researchers who had tried to replicate the findings of a given study, only 39% of them were able to do so just several years after the initial study was published, despite communication between them and the original researchers being allowed throughout the process. And if you want a slightly more objective ratio, although I would actually go with the subjective one here, just divide the percentage of replicated studies, uh, which were statistically significant, by the percentage of original studies that were. So that's 0.36 over 0.97, which is 37%. Again, this is bloody atrocious. Whatever way you slice it, it's pretty bad news. And that was just the start. Since then, this phenomenon, which in psychology, became known as the replication crisis, began to, ironically enough, be replicated when the findings in many other scholarly fields were subjected to systematic attempts at the reproduction of research findings. This was truly shocking and disheartening to many scientists, of course, but it was much more so to many science journalists and laypersons who didn't really understand how science really works, how messy it can be, and in fact, usually is. To be honest, though, I know earlier I said I was dismayed to hear this, and I was, but having already read all volumes of the Inserto, highly recommend, by the way, by Nassim Nicholas Taleb, which had already been published at the time. Uh, that is Fooled by Randomness, The Black Swan, and Anti-Fragile. And also having read John Ioannidis' landmark 2005 paper, Why Most Published Research Findings Are False, I wasn't shocked and dismayed at the direction of the findings here. That is, that many failed to replicate more than zero. The fact that the finding has a positive effect, just at the magnitude. If someone had asked me beforehand, I might have guessed that somewhere around 60% of the studies would replicate. Trying to put myself in the old shoes. Not less than 40%, though. Certainly not. So, mates, what can be done? I've heard several interesting and reasonable sounding proposals, some of them from the aforementioned John Ioannidis himself, such as lowering the alpha significance slash p-value threshold in many fields from 0.05 to 0.005. This would mean that to claim a discovery or significant effect, the evidence would need to be stronger than what's currently required. A lower p-value threshold would theoretically reduce the number of false positives. As a data scientist myself, I can tell you that the difference between needing to surpass the threshold of 0.005 and 0.05 is a dramatic difference. And he has made many other interesting methodological suggestions along with those made by other researchers as well. However, I want to come at this problem from a different angle here. It seems to me that this problem of a general lack of understand of reproducibility, of research findings across many domains of science or fields which call themselves something science is something which cannot reasonably ever be fixed permanently, in the sense that once you have found a set of methodological improvements which have fixed the problem of low replicability once implemented in your field for some amount of time, you can then simply stop attempting to replicate new studies to make sure it's still working. The reason is similar to how any specific theory can be definitively falsified once and for all, but never definitively verified empirically once and for all. Let me give a hypothetical example to illustrate why. Let A refer to some set of new methodological standards required by studies for studies by journals and doctoral dissertation committees alike for acceptance improves the replication rate in some scientific subfield, say labor economics as an example, from 35% to 85% for 3 straight years within several months after implementation of A across doctoral committees overseeing and deciding on labor economics dissertations and labor economics journals. Now what? Should we assume that this amazing 3 year track record, improvement by 50 percentage points is pretty great, right? Was the real cause of the improvement and is bound to remain at or near that effective of a remedy going forward indefinitely, and therefore we can now abandon the annoying professional and scholarly norm we just established of replication to check to make sure that it is continuing to be just effective, or that it really was the cause of that dramatic increase in the replication rate? I say no. Whether or not this implicit assumption is true in any given case is not something we could ever know a priori, right? Here are my 3.5 concrete proposals. As a result, I propose 3.5 changes to the way scientific research labs, departments at universities which conduct academic research, and private think tanks which fund genuine scholarship go about fostering the production of rigorous knowledge. Proposal number one. All such research institutions hire people who are technically competent with respect to standard research methods and the types of statistical tests and or modeling techniques used within a given field, but who are also competent with techniques of meta-analysis or systematic literature synthesis where meta-analyses are not possible, and assign them as full-time meta-researchers of prior studies with the goal of identifying the previous papers which ought to have resources devoted to them for attempted replications. It would also be possible to reallocate persons already on staff as researchers, or more likely as research assistants for these roles. Proposal 1.5. I added this extra idea later along after publishing this article. Another possible new research role should be people who do research on systematic or formulaic ways to find the best papers to try to replicate, because otherwise it may be done with ulterior motives, such as a researcher choosing to replicate a paper by his or her mentor to make sure it does replicate due to personal loyalty. On the opposite direction, a researcher is envious or has a personal beef with someone in their field, choosing one of their recent papers to try to ensure that it fails to replicate. Note for proposal 1.5, the way the 100 papers which were to be replicated were chosen during the first replication attempt in psychology was by selecting well-known and respected journals in psychology, or perhaps just one, then randomly selecting 100 of those papers published in 2009 and 2008. And if they ran out of paper in a given year, they would just continue on in the next year. This is a great way to avoid just picking the most sensational recent papers, the most popular recent papers among the public and the media, the most cited recent papers published by professional rivals of whoever's doing the attempted replication, right? And yet, while avoiding this is great, it still might not be the optimal approach, in my opinion. There may be a better way that also attempts to avoid these, but also identifies more important papers somehow in more reasonable, objective sense. Proposal number 2, require, and yes, I said require, current researchers on staff to publish at least one replication for every 2, 3, or 4 original studies they're allowed to submit for publication. Either that or spend 25 to 40% of their research time allocated to attempts at reproducing previous studies, because I understand that things can always go wrong during research, and I have to admit that although I cannot think of any reason why this should be the case, it might be possible that it is usually much more difficult and time consuming on average to replicate a study than it is to complete an original study from scratch. Proposal number 3. I did this one later on as well. Require all researchers, including professors who have producing research papers as part of their job, whether they're associate, assistant, and full-time professors, with or without tenure, to attempt to replicate a recent paper within their discipline for every 5 or 10 research papers they publish, and get this attempted replication published. This one would have to emerge as a cross-journal social and professional norm within fields of research from the bottom up, because to my knowledge, most scholars do not get most of their papers published in the same journal. So journals would have to enforce this by only publishing your 5th or 10th paper in a row without submitting an attempted replication for publication in another recognized legitimate journals in their field or subfield, regardless of whether this was the first paper you had ever submitted to them. Can you think of a 4th concrete proposal or strategy to improve science? Please let me know in the comments below if you see any major problems with any of these 3.5 proposals, or they make you think of a different proposal which you personally feel is superior.